Where were you last night? I could feel her eyes burning into the back of my head as I stood at the kitchen counter, pouring my morning coffee. The air was thick, tense, the kind of tension that makes your spine tingle. I didn't turn around. I took a slow sip instead, letting the silence hang. Out, I finally said, keeping my voice calm, controlled. Out where, exactly? She pressed, her tone rising, a hint of venom dripping into the words. I sighed and set the mug down, finally turning to face her. Sarah, my soon-to-be ex-wife, was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, one brow raised. She had that look on her face. The one she always wore when she was fishing for an argument, the one that showed she was already convinced she knew the answer. She didn't want the truth. She wanted confirmation. I was at work, I said, keeping my expression as neutral as possible. Late night, you know how it is. She scoffed, rolling her eyes. Really? That's what you're going with? Work? Do you think I'm stupid? I stared at her, saying nothing, because frankly, I knew this wasn't about where I was last night. This wasn't even about me. This was about her guilt, projected like a spotlight. It had been for weeks now. Ever since I'd caught wind of her little affair. Not that she knew I knew. Why would I lie to you, Sarah? I asked, the edge in my voice starting to sharpen. It's not like we've been spending much time together anyway. She flinched at that, but tried to cover it up by glaring harder. Don't try to turn this around on me. You didn't come home until after midnight. I checked. Ah, so now we're counting hours. I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. Yeah, because I had to finish up some reports. But please, continue. Tell me what you think I was doing. She threw her hands in the air, her frustration boiling over. I know what you were doing. You're seeing someone else. Don't even try to deny it. I've seen the way you've been acting, sneaking around, keeping secrets. You think I haven't noticed? I blinked slowly, taking a breath. Sarah, you're out of your mind. Am I? She shot back, stepping closer, jabbing a finger toward my chest. You come home late, you're always on your phone, you're distant, cold. This isn't the man I married. What happened to us? The irony of that statement nearly made me laugh. What happened to us? As if I were the one who had set this all in motion. But I wasn't about to let her see that. No, I had to play this just right. I stared down at her, letting the silence hang again. I could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. Good. She was second-guessing herself. I'm not seeing anyone, I said, softening my tone. But it's clear you don't trust me anymore. Her jaw clenched, her eyes narrowing. Why would I? You've been acting suspicious for weeks. And you've been distant for months, I shot back, my voice turning colder. What's really going on here, Sarah? Why are you so eager to accuse me of cheating? Her face flushed, the anger twisting into something else. Panic, maybe. Guilt. She was slipping, and she knew it. I'm not the one hiding things, she cried, her voice cracking slightly. I sighed, stepping back and leaning against the counter, arms crossed. You know what, Sarah? You're right. I have been distant. And yeah, I've been keeping secrets. I let that sink in, watching her reaction closely. She looked like she was on the edge of some kind of emotional cliff, teetering. What? What are you saying? She asked, her voice quieter now, less sure of herself. I held her gaze, keeping my expression unreadable. I'm saying maybe you're not the only one who's noticed things changing. But I don't think it's me you should be worried about. Her eyes widened, confusion clouding her face. What the hell is that supposed to mean? I let out a slow breath, pretending to hesitate. Maybe I've been suspicious of you. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, like a fish gasping for air, as if the idea had never even crossed her mind. As if it were unthinkable that she might be the one under the microscope. What? You think I'm cheating? She snapped, the defensiveness creeping back in, but I saw the fear beneath it now. She was unraveling. I shrugged, trying to look indifferent. I didn't say that. But you're implying it. I tilted my head, giving her a long, hard look. I'm not implying anything. I'm just saying. People in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. For a moment, she stood there, staring at me, her face a mix of anger and disbelief. I could see her brain working overtime, trying to process the fact that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as clever as she thought. That maybe I was onto her. And that was the moment I knew I had her. I pushed off the counter and walked past her toward the door, grabbing my keys off the hook. I've got to get to work, I said casually. We'll talk about this later. Sarah didn't say anything as I left, but I could feel her eyes boring into my back, trying to figure out if I was bluffing. The car engine hummed quietly as I drove through the suburban streets, the familiar roads passing by like a blur. I could still feel Sarah's eyes on me, the weight of her accusations hanging in the air like smog. But instead of feeling frustrated or angry, I felt something else. A spark of satisfaction. It was working, my plan, that is. Sarah thought she was the only one playing this game, but she had no idea that I'd been pulling the strings from the shadows for weeks now. Why would I cheat? I muttered to myself, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. I already know you're doing it. It all started a month ago. A Saturday morning, to be exact. I'd come home from running errands and found Sarah in our bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone like she was waiting for a message that never came. The moment she saw me, she locked the screen, but she couldn't hide the nervous way her fingers trembled, or how her face turned redder than a Christmas ornament. That's when the doubts started creeping in. At first, I pushed it away, refusing to believe it. But then the late nights began. The suspicious text notifications she'd ignore. The constant excuses. It wasn't hard to put the pieces together. And when I saw her walk out of a restaurant with some guy I didn't recognize a week later, the picture became clear. I didn't confront her right then and there, though. No, that would have been too easy. Instead, I started planning. If she wanted to accuse me of being distant, fine. I'd give her exactly what she was looking for. A husband who looked like he had something to hide. I parked the car outside of work and sat there for a moment, staring at the dashboard, running through the details in my head. Every move had to be perfect. Every word, every glance, it was all part of the show. I wanted her to feel like she had caught me in something, to push her guilt into overdrive. Last night had been the final act in that setup. I didn't actually have anywhere to be last night, but I left the house anyway. I didn't even have a destination in mind. I drove around for hours, knowing she'd be sitting at home, wondering where I was. The longer I stayed out, the more her paranoia would grow. And the moment I came back, after midnight, she was waiting for me, exactly as I'd planned. And now? Now she was scrambling. I knew her mind was spinning 100 miles an hour, trying to figure out what I knew, or worse, what I might have done. It was almost funny, really. She thought I was having an affair when the truth was, I had barely spoken to anyone outside of work in months. The only thing I was guilty of was setting the perfect trap. But it wasn't just about playing mind games. I had bigger plans. This marriage was dead, and we both knew it. But Sarah, being Sarah, wasn't going to make it easy for me to walk away cleanly. So I had to give her a reason to let go. Or rather, think she was letting go on her terms. Serve her on Christmas, I muttered, the thought bubbling up again. The divorce papers were already drawn up, sitting in a folder in my office, waiting. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to hit her with them. And what better moment than Christmas Day? A day she'd never forget. I walked into work, keeping my head down as I made my way to my desk. My coworkers were buzzing around the office, talking about holiday plans, the upcoming parties, but I couldn't focus on any of that. My mind was locked in on Sarah. On what she'd do next. My phone buzzed. Speak of the devil. Sarah, we need to talk. Of course we do. I chuckled to myself and slipped the phone back into my pocket, not bothering to reply right away. Let her stew in it a little longer. Make her wonder if I was ignoring her, or if I was with someone else. I sat down at my desk and fired up my computer, pretending to work while my mind continued spinning. The beauty of this plan was that I didn't have to do much more. Sarah was already unraveling. She would dig her own grave, one way or another. The only thing left was to wait. A few hours passed, and I eventually caved, sending her a brief reply, "We'll talk tonight." I could imagine her sitting at home, staring at her phone, waiting for those three little dots to appear, hoping for some explanation that would make her feel better about her own sins. But all she'd get was silence. As the day dragged on, I thought back to how it used to be. The Sarah I fell in love with wasn't this paranoid, suspicious person she'd become. She used to be open, caring, someone I could trust without a second thought. But people change, don't they? I certainly had. It was funny, really. I'd spent years being faithful, working late hours, sacrificing time with friends, all for the sake of this relationship. And now here I was, carefully crafting my own escape, playing the role of the distant, cheating husband just to match the narrative she'd already written in her head. She didn't want the truth, she wanted to feel justified. That night, when I walked through the front door, Sarah was sitting at the dining table, her phone in hand, a half-empty glass of wine in front of her. She didn't look up at me immediately, but I could feel the tension crackling in the air. "We need to talk," she repeated, her voice steady but sharp. "Yeah, we do," I said, slipping off my jacket and hanging it on the chair. I kept my movement slow, deliberate, making sure she knew I wasn't in any rush to answer to her. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit." I hesitated for a moment, then took the seat, folding my hands in front of me, waiting for her to speak. She didn't start right away, though. Instead, she stared at me, her eyes searching my face like she was trying to read my mind. "Where were you last night?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I took a breath, leaned back in the chair, and smiled ever so slightly. This was it. The moment she'd been waiting for. "I told you," I said, my voice calm. "I was out." "Out where? Does it matter?" Her eyes flashed with anger, and she slammed her hand on the table. "Of course it matters. I know you're hiding something, and I deserve to know what it is." I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "Do you? Or are you just trying to justify something you've already done?" The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Sarah's hand froze midair, fingers clenched into a fist as if she was about to strike the table again. Her face paled, and for a split second, her eyes betrayed her. Fear. Panic. She didn't expect that. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice cracking just a little, like a chink in her armor. I didn't flinch. I kept my gaze steady, letting the silence do most of the talking. Letting her sit in the moment, feel the weight of the accusation hanging between us. This wasn't just a game anymore, it was a showdown. And I had every intention of winning. "You've been acting strange for months, Sarah. It's like you've been pulling away," I began, keeping my voice calm, almost detached. "At first, I thought it was just a rough patch. Every marriage has them, right? But then I started noticing things." "What things?" she spat, eyes narrowing. "You're the one who's been distant. You're the one sneaking around." "I had to, didn't I?" I leaned back, crossing my arms. Had to see if what I suspected was true. Her face twisted into a sneer, but the fear hadn't left her eyes. "Suspected what? That I'm some kind of monster?" I shook my head slowly, feigning a look of disappointment. "No. I suspected you were seeing someone else." Her eyes widened, just for a heartbeat, and I caught it. That tiny flicker of confirmation. I almost smiled, but I held it back. Now wasn't the time for victory laps. "That's ridiculous," she said, but the words lacked bite. She wasn't attacking now, she was retreating. "You sure about that?" I asked, letting the question hang in the air. For a moment, the room was silent. Sarah looked down at her glass, her fingers tapping nervously against the stem. I could see her mind working, trying to figure out how to recover, how to twist this back in her favor. But I wasn't going to give her the chance. "You know," I continued, leaning forward again, "it makes sense now. Why you've been accusing me of cheating. You thought I'd never notice what was really going on. But the thing is, Sarah, I'm not stupid." Her eyes snapped up to meet mine, and there it was again, that flash of panic. She was unraveling, just as I'd hoped. "You're paranoid," she snapped, but her voice shook. "You're the one who's been hiding things, not me." "Really?" I tilted my head, letting the corner of my mouth lift into a half smile. "Because I saw you. I saw you with him." Her face drained of color. I had her. Now it was time to twist the knife. I wasn't going to say anything, I continued, my tone measured, as if I was the calm one in all of this. "But when you started accusing me of sneaking around, it became obvious. You needed me to be the bad guy so you wouldn't have to look in the mirror. So, tell me, Sarah, how long has this been going on?" Her lips quivered, and I could see the internal battle raging in her head. She wanted to deny it, to lash out, but she couldn't. Not anymore. Not after I'd seen the truth. She started, then stopped, her breath catching. "You're crazy." "Am I?" I said quietly. "Or am I just tired of pretending everything's fine?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't moved. I'd seen this performance before. Sarah had always been good at turning on the waterworks when things didn't go her way. But this time, it wasn't going to work. "I saw you with him, Sarah," I said, my voice cold now. "At that restaurant 2 weeks ago. You weren't even trying to hide it." She blinked rapidly, shaking her head as if she could make it all go away. It's not what you think. I can explain." "Of course, you can," I replied with a bitter laugh. "That's what you're good at, isn't it? Explaining away your lies. But I don't need your explanations anymore. I've already made my decision." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she looked utterly broken. What are you saying?" "I'm saying this is over." I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor as I pushed it back. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. You'll be getting the papers soon." Her face twisted into shock, then disbelief. "You're leaving me? Over some stupid misunderstanding?" I walked around the table, standing over her now. "It's not a misunderstanding, Sarah. You've been lying to me for months. And I'm done pretending like we can fix this. She stood up abruptly, her chair tipping over as she did. You can't just walk away. This is our marriage. We can work through this. We always have. Not this time. I kept my voice firm, unshakable. You've already checked out. You just didn't think I'd be the one to call it quits. Her hands trembled as she reached out to grab my arm, desperation clear in her eyes. Please, we can fix this. I know I've made mistakes, but you can't throw everything away over one. Stop. I pulled my arm back, stepping away from her. Don't act like this is something we can fix. You've made your choice, and now I'm making mine. Her eyes filled with tears again, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't afford to. Not when I was so close to the finish line. I'll be gone by Christmas, I said, turning toward the door. Wait, she cried out, her voice cracking. You're just going to leave? Just like that? I paused at the doorway, glancing back at her. No. You'll be the one leaving. I've already set everything in motion. Her face crumpled in confusion. What? What do you mean? I smiled, the cold satisfaction curling inside me. You'll find out soon enough. Without waiting for her reply, I walked out of the room, leaving her standing there in shock, her whole world crumbling around her. The next few days passed in a blur. Sarah had been too stunned to say much more after our confrontation, and I gave her space to wallow in her guilt. Meanwhile, I made my own preparations, packing up the essentials, securing my assets, and finalizing the paperwork with my lawyer. I hadn't told her when the divorce papers would arrive, but I knew exactly when they'd hit her doorstep. Christmas morning. A part of me felt cruel, delivering the final blow on a day meant for joy and family, but then again, Sarah had spent months betraying me behind my back. If she wanted to play games, then I'd show her just how ruthless I could be. On Christmas Eve, I packed the last of my bags and left the house while she was asleep. There was no need for a final goodbye. By the time she woke up, I'd be nothing more than a ghost. Christmas morning came, and I sat in my rented apartment, sipping coffee while my phone buzzed relentlessly. Sarah had sent a barrage of texts, each one more frantic than the last. Sarah, where are you? Sarah, please, can we talk? Sarah, I woke up and you're gone. Why are you doing this? I ignored them all. I'd already done what I needed to do. And then, the final message arrived. Sarah, I just got the papers. You can't be serious. Is this really how you're ending it? I smiled as I set the phone down, my heart strangely calm. It was over. And for the first time in months, I felt free. Across town, I imagined Sarah sitting alone in the living room, surrounded by unopened presents, the Christmas tree lights twinkling ironically as the reality of the situation finally hit her. The divorce papers, neatly bound and delivered with the same cold efficiency she'd shown me in the months leading up to this moment, would be the final gift she'd never forget. I could almost picture her face as she unfolded the documents, eyes scanning over the cold, clinical language that spelled the end of our marriage. The accusations, the lies, the paranoia, none of it mattered anymore. I had orchestrated my exit flawlessly. She thought she had control, but she had never been further from it. The coffee was still hot in my hand as I leaned back in the chair, the quiet apartment a stark contrast to the chaos I knew was probably unfolding back at the house. I let out a slow breath, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. It wasn't just about revenge, though, or even punishing her for her betrayal. No, it was about something deeper than that. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity. She had taken those things from me without a second thought, but I wasn't the passive, clueless husband she had assumed I was. I'd outplayed her. Just as I was settling into this newfound calm, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at it, expecting another desperate message from Sarah, but this time, it was my lawyer. Lawyer, papers are officially served. Merry Christmas. I chuckled to myself, setting the phone aside. The timing was perfect, and the execution flawless. Now, all I had to do was disappear, fade into the background like a ghost. The life we had built was just a memory now, and soon, I would be nothing more than a phantom to her. I thought back to the final conversation we had that night, the moment when I saw the fear in her eyes. That was the moment I knew it was time to pull the trigger. She wasn't expecting me to walk away. She thought she had me locked in her web of deceit, waiting for me to break. But I'd outsmarted her, and now she was left standing in the ruins of her own making. As Christmas Day dragged on, I kept an eye on my phone, but the texts stopped coming. Sarah had either given up or was too busy trying to process everything. I knew she'd go through all the stages, shock, anger, bargaining, but it didn't matter anymore. I was done. The next few days were blissfully quiet. No more accusations, no more mind games. Just the sound of my own thoughts, free and clear for the first time in what felt like forever. I spent my time sorting through the last few details with my lawyer, making sure everything was in place for a clean break. Sarah would get her share, but I'd kept what mattered. My freedom. My dignity. My future. One evening, about a week after Christmas, I got a call from her. I stared at the phone for a long moment, contemplating whether or not to pick up. Part of me was curious. Part of me wanted to hear what she had to say, to see how far she'd fallen since that fateful morning. But another part of me, the smarter part, knew that it didn't matter. Nothing she could say would change anything. I let the phone ring. And then, as it finally went silent, I deleted her number. By the time New Year's Eve rolled around, I was a new man. A ghost in Sarah's world, yes, but in my own? I felt more alive than I had in years. I wasn't haunted by the past anymore. I wasn't weighed down by the endless cycle of mistrust and betrayal. I was free. I sat on the balcony of my apartment, looking out over the city as fireworks began to light up the sky. The vibrant explosions of color and light felt like a fitting end to the chapter I'd just closed. As I watched the fireworks bloom, I allowed myself a final thought of Sarah. I imagined her, sitting alone, probably replaying everything over and over in her head, trying to figure out where she'd gone wrong, how I'd managed to slip through her fingers. But that was the thing about ghosts, you couldn't catch them. I raised my glass to the sky, a small toast to my newfound freedom, and smiled as the fireworks reflected in the glass. Here's to new beginnings, I muttered, taking a sip of champagne. And with that, I let the past fade away for good. The city skyline glittered beneath me as the New Year's Eve fireworks faded into the night. I was perched on the balcony of my new apartment, feeling the cold breeze against my skin. It was strange, but the chill felt invigorating, like a fresh start was in the air. The days following Christmas had been a whirlwind of legal paperwork, phone calls, and logistical arrangements. I'd set everything in motion to ensure a clean break, and now, as the new year approached, I could finally breathe easy. Sarah had been silent since the initial shock of receiving the divorce papers. I had no doubt she was still grappling with the fallout, but that wasn't my concern anymore. My phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. I picked it up to find a message from a friend, inviting me to a small New Year's gathering. I hesitated for a moment before hitting yes. It felt good to reconnect with people who hadn't been part of my life for a while. A fresh start wasn't just about the end of a relationship, it was about rebuilding connections and rediscovering who I was outside of that marriage. I dressed in a simple, sharp suit and headed out, feeling a blend of excitement and nervousness. It had been so long since I'd socialized outside the context of my crumbling marriage. But tonight, I wasn't just putting on a brave face, I was stepping into a new chapter of my life. When I arrived at the party, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. Laughter and chatter filled the room, and I could already see old friends mingling and catching up. I was greeted with smiles and handshakes, and soon I found myself slipping into conversations that felt light and genuine. "Hey, it's great to see you," my friend Tom exclaimed as he spotted me. "You're just in time for the countdown." "Good to be here," I replied, shaking his hand. "It's been a while." Tom clapped me on the back and led me to the living room, where a group of friends were gathered around the TV, ready for the New Year's countdown. As the clock ticked down, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. 10, 9, 8. The crowd chanted, and I could feel the energy building. By the time we reached 1, cheers erupted, and glasses were raised in celebration. I clinked my glass with Tom's and took a deep breath, savoring the moment. This was more than just a new year, it was a new beginning. Later in the evening, as the party wound down and guests started to filter out, I found myself in a quiet corner with a few close friends. We talked about the past year, shared our hopes for the future, and reminisced about old times. It felt good to reconnect, to feel that sense of belonging that I had been missing for so long. As the last of the guests departed, I found myself standing alone on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. The air was crisp, and I let it wash over me, feeling a profound sense of relief. It was over. Sarah, the marriage, the endless cycle of deceit and suspicion, it was all behind me now. My phone buzzed again, and I saw a message from my lawyer. It was a brief note confirming that the divorce had been officially processed and that Sarah had acknowledged the terms. I read it with a detached calm, knowing that there was nothing more to be done. It was done. The closure I'd been seeking was finally within my grasp. The next few weeks were a blur of moving into my new apartment, catching up with friends, and adjusting to my new routine. I threw myself into work and started exploring hobbies I had neglected over the years. It was liberating, discovering parts of myself that had been buried under the weight of a failing marriage. One evening, as I was organizing some old photographs, I came across a picture of Sarah and me from better days. We were smiling, happy. It was strange how time had a way of distorting memories. What had once seemed like a perfect life now felt like a distant dream. I studied the picture for a moment, then placed it in a box marked memories and set it aside. I thought about Sarah, and though I felt a pang of sadness for what could have been, there was no longer any bitterness. Life had a way of moving on, and so had I. I wished her well, wherever she was, and hoped she would find her own path to happiness. The final step in my journey was embracing the future. I made plans to travel, to experience new places and meet new people. The world was wide open, full of possibilities I hadn't considered before. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly alive. As I settled into my new life, I found solace in the small things, quiet evenings with a good book, spontaneous road trips, and reconnecting with the parts of myself that had been lost. I was no longer defined by my past, but by the choices I made to shape my future. The past year had been a roller coaster of emotions, but as the months went by, I felt a growing sense of peace. The ghost of my former self was finally laid to rest, and in its place was a man who had reclaimed his life and his happiness. And so, as I stood on the balcony one last time, looking out at the city lights, I raised a toast to the future. To new beginnings, to personal growth, and to the endless possibilities that lay ahead. Here's to the next chapter.